Hello, this is Chris Browder, and this is video 5.1 in my series on second language acquisition. We're going to be talking about interlanguage development right now. My two main sources for this presentation are Rod Ellis's text, Understanding Second Language Acquisition, and Lightbound and Spada's text, How Languages Are Learned. The term interlanguage was coined by Larry Salenker in 1972. I mean, it wasn't a complete revolution for the time. Carter and other people had been talking about what they call learner languages, okay? But this term is very important for SLA, and he's the guy who gave it to us. This is the term that SLA researchers generally use to refer to a second language learner's developing second language competence. It's basically a version of the target language that is unique to the learner. And some people have referred to these interlanguages as learner languages, okay? So, idiosyncratic versions of the language used by people who are learning the language. According to his original idea, an interlanguage is an internal system of knowledge the learner is constructing in his or her mind. So, it's basically a language that's under construction. Research tells us that interlanguages are constructed in predictable stages. Learners begin building their interlanguage with their first language because, well, that is all they have at first. Over time, as learners acquire more knowledge of the second language, the interlanguage changes, right? It's picking up more of those L2 rules, and more begins to resemble the L2. But most second language learners stop making progress eventually, usually long before the interlanguage ever matches the L2. Salenker called this incomplete ending or cessation of learning. He called it fossilization. Pretty scary term, right? Like turning to stone. All right, so after what we've learned about these older theories of learning in previous videos, much of what you see with the idea of interlanguage should seem pretty familiar to you by now. And that's because Salenker was essentially synthesizing much of the theory and research of the day into one hybrid, kind of newish idea. So, first of all, in his idea, you can see the influence of cognitivism because interlanguage theory is concerned with what's happening in the mind of the learner, right? It's trying to get a look inside. You can also see the influence of generative linguistics because interlanguage theory proposes that the learner is learning rules and learning to use them creatively to produce and understand utterances that he or she's never heard before. Interlanguage theory also smacks of constructivism because it views learning as a process by which learners construct systems of knowledge in their mind by connecting new learning to old learning. And it expects that development comes in predictable stages. Because one thing, is a prerequisite somehow for the next, or built on the previous. Last but not least, interlanguage theory even seems to borrow a little bit from behaviorism because it states that the L1 is the foundation on which the L2 is built. L1 rules are used to build the interlanguage until L2 rules are available. The introduction of interlanguage theory into SLA raised a lot of issues. Many of these issues are still being debated today. So, for example, what roles do explicit or implicit learning play in the interlanguage development? Does grammar teaching help? What about the memorization of phrases and sentences? If you're memorizing something, is it altering the interlanguage in any way? And of course, then there comes fossilization. What exactly is fossilization? It really like the learner turns to stone, like Medusa or the Ice Queen does something to the learner. Is this reversible? Is fossilization even real? Um, is it possible that fossilization is like some kind of like ingrained bad habits or automatized incorrect routines? And if that's true, then is there some way to reprogram a learner? Or is it just simply that the learner is satisfied with their interlanguage and doesn't feel the need to focus the energy on improving it? Is it possible that a learner just gets to the point where they just say, "Hey, I'm good enough," and stops trying to move forward? Is it simply a matter of motivation? The introduction of interlanguage theory into SLA ushered in an era of interlanguage development research. Researchers wanted to know what the predictable stages are that learners go through. And this is basically a search for universal processes in second language acquisition. And that's basically what we get out of this. The earliest studies were the Morpheme studies of the 1970s. In these studies, SLA researchers borrowed methods from first language researchers such as Jean Burko or Roger Brown to figure out what predictable stages learners go through in acquiring second languages. So, in 1973, for example, SLA researchers Heidi DeLay and Marina Burt set out to understand how children acquired grammatical morphemes such as the ed ending we use for past tense or the s ending we use for plurals. So, as you might remember, Jean Burko in her experiments with first language learning would show the kids pictures and ask them to talk about the pictures. And this would elicit certain grammar forms. DeLay and Burt were doing the same thing with these children, but these children were learning English as a second language. DeLay and Burt worked with Spanish and Chinese speaking children learning English as a second language. They showed the children pictures and asked them to talk about the pictures, and then they counted each type of morpheme they used to see which ones they used and which ones they didn't use. So, for example, like what you can see here on the slide, ing, they counted each time it was used. Plural s, they counted each time it was used. And they kept track of it all on charts for each child. They found evidence that these children were learning these morphemes in a predictable order. Moreover, the Spanish speaking children and the Chinese speaking children seemed to follow the same order, despite the fact that their languages were very different. The following year, SLA researchers Bailey, Madden, and Krashen reproduced the same study, but this time with adult language learners. They found that adults followed the same order as children despite having very different L1s. They concluded that the L1 and grammar instruction had little influence on the second language acquisition. They claimed to have discovered a built-in syllabus for second language acquisition. This, as you should guess, this kind of smacks of innatism. Over the past 50 years, researchers have reproduced these studies in many different ways and concluded that they were largely correct, but that there are some problems with these findings. Some researchers, like Kenji Hakuta, for example, reproduced these studies and found that the learner's first language really actually does play a much larger role than the original studies claim. People, for example, people whose first language is Korean or Japanese take much longer to learn English articles such as and the because they don't have anything similar in their first language. So it's not exactly the same order of acquisition. Another problem is with formulaic speech. SLA researchers use this term formulaic speech to refer to these memorized chunks, phrases, sentence starters, and sentences that language learners rely so heavily on. For example, many English learners might memorize a sentence starter like, do you have? They might use it to say, do you have a pencil? Do you have paper? Do you have car? Do you have girlfriend? So they might be using this expression for a very, very long time without really getting control over its individual grammatical components. So they might not actually know how to really form actual do questions, but they're using this sentence starter as a scaffold. How can a researcher tell the difference between these memorized chunks of language and acquired grammar? For that matter, is there really a difference? Especially problematic is the claim that the order of morpheme acquisition is some sort of force of nature, like a built in syllabus that all humans follow innately and have no control over. Researchers such as Goldschneider and De Keyser have pointed out that there are many logical explanations why some grammar forms are acquired before others, that you don't necessarily need to attribute it to nature. So the first of these forces that they identified were what they called salience. Salience means that the grammar form is noticeable. Um, so you can hear it, you can see it. Notice that the first form in the order of acquisition that DeLay and Burt discovered is the ing morpheme. But isn't the ing morpheme very noticeable and audible? It's easy to miss these other morphemes when you're listening to someone who is talking quickly, right? Especially when they're blending their words and blurring things. But this one, this ing sound, it stands out. It stays pretty audible. So it makes sense that that's the first one that people learn. Then comes linguistic complexity. It's pretty simple to add an ing to a verb. Run becomes running, walk becomes walking. But controlling the be verb copula in English is very different because it can take so many different forms. That be verb can become is, am, are, was, were, and it can move all over the place, and it can be added, combined with other things like isn't and wasn't and weren't. And then there's these informal ones like ain't, right? So obviously the B coupler is going to take much longer to learn than the ing, right? Then comes semantic transparency. That refers to how clearly meaningful a grammar form is. Does it have a clear and strong meaning? The plural S is acquired early on, obviously, because it changes the meaning of the word that you put it on. And there's a difference between one apple and two apples. That's a change in meaning, right? But the third person singular S, in contrast, doesn't seem to have any meaning at all. It seems kind of disposable. There's really not much difference between he like ice cream and he likes ice cream. I mean, the difference is really just grammatical correctness, but it doesn't change the meaning. Then comes similarity to L1 forms. Some of these easier English morphemes have very similar morphemes in other languages. So, for example, the Spanish way of making plurals is remarkably similar to the English way of making plurals. This must help, right? Finally comes frequency. Is the grammar form common? Obviously, you're going to learn something much faster if you see it and hear it more often. You're going to learn it much faster if you're forced to use it more often. Plurals are more common than past tense. And hey, what do you know? According to this, they're acquired sooner. So, by this time, you're probably thinking about how to apply this when you're teaching English. And unfortunately, there is no clear application. In fact, some people can get mad at you, depending on how you apply it or misapply it. And you might end up doing more harm than good. So let's talk about these approaches. I'd like to suggest that there are three different approaches, but warn you that they're not very compatible and that you can get in trouble for each one. In the first approach, the teacher carefully studies the errors that each student is making in spontaneous speaking and writing and uses this slow, careful error analysis process to figure out exactly what stage that student is on that day so she can teach that specific student exactly what he's ready to learn at that exact moment. SLA researchers such as Stephen Krashen, however, have wisely warned us that this is just not realistic. It ain't going to happen. The teacher can never really know what stage each student is in because she has too many students. Students' stages are changing very frequently, and there's so many variables. And it's just way too difficult. No teacher has that much time to do that. That's why Krashen would suggest the second approach, which is just scrapping grammar instruction altogether. And this makes perfect sense to Krashen, of course, because, as you may recall, he believes the natural order is evidence that grammar instruction does not help, because he believes that his evidence shows that the natural order remains the same no matter whether you teach the grammar or don't teach the grammar. Doesn't matter what order you teach the grammar in, the natural order remains the same. Therefore, grammar instruction has no effect at all. That's what Krashen would tell you. Some people beg to differ. The third approach is a kind of middle ground between the first and the second. In this approach, the teacher can teach whatever grammar she likes based on whatever textbook or curriculum she has, but she needs to understand that the learners will continue to make errors with certain forms when speaking and writing until they are developmentally ready to acquire those forms. And maybe she's going to, revisit those forms every year, hoping that one of these days the kids are going to get it right, and they might learn those forms explicitly. They might do them well on tests and grammar worksheets, but as far as the actual interlanguage, that could take some time. In this approach, the teacher understands that errors are a natural part of learning a language and doesn't get upset that her grammar lesson didn't change the students' lives forever. And she doesn't get upset that they're making mistakes with this grammar form that she just taught them yesterday. Well, it might not be helpful for a teacher to know the natural order of acquisition, but it may be helpful for teachers to see what universal processes are taking place in their students' learning. Maybe we can help the process along if we know what's going on inside the learners' heads, or at least maybe we can not mess up the process, right? Researchers have identified many universal processes in second language learning, like the ones I was just describing, like the salience, for example, that appears to be a universal. The first of these is what people call item learning. I think I mentioned that already here. Item learning includes the learning of individual vocabulary words, but it also includes the learning of formulaic speech, unanalyzed chunks of language, sentence stems, phrases, all those things that you memorize or use formulaically. When people first start learning a language, it is usually item learning as opposed to rule learning. ESOL students, for example, learn "Hello, how are you?" long before they learn the rules for forming questions with how. So they're using these memorized how questions, but they don't really actually have the ability to control the question syntax and this how word. So they can be saying something very complex like, can you please tell me where the bathroom is? But they don't really know that grammar, and they don't really even have to know the vocabulary. People learning languages in immersion situations generally focus on learning what is needed for them to complete some immediate communicative tasks, such as asking directions or ordering food in a restaurant. Tourists, for example, often memorize phrases from their translator apps or phrase books. This immediate this immediate need, it drives people to acquire a lot initially through this item learning process instead of this rule learning process. And the need makes the language experience relevant, memorable, and meaningful. And maybe teachers can learn something from this. Next comes simplification. Simplification happens when learners are focusing on meaning rather than getting the form correct, and they're struggling with their brain's own limited processing power. In this stage, the phrases that the learner might have already memorized and maybe the learner's been using these phrases correctly for a long time, they might start dropping pieces from these phrases. It's like a person who's trying to carry too many things at one time. He's going to drop a few things, and if he realizes that he's dropping things, he'll probably be more careful to make sure he's only dropping things that are not important. So for this reason, this stage involves a lot of missing grammar forms. So for example, where is the bathroom becomes where bathroom. May I have a pen, please? Becomes pen, please. Right? So you get the picture. Okay. It appears that these people are going backwards, but this isn't backwards. This is forwards. Eventually, the learner starts learning grammar rules, and learning grammar rules doesn't necessarily start with what we think. It might start off with substituting pieces in memorized phrases. They might learn to say, I want to go, and then realize they can also say, I want to play, I want to sleep, I want to eat, I want a breakfast, I want a car. Gradually, with or without grammar instruction, this appears to turn into a system of generative rules that kind of approximate grammar. Again, however, the learner might appear to be going backwards because certain sentences that they had originally learned with item learning are now being created by rule learning, and their rules are far from perfect. When learners learn a new rule, they will generally make a lot of mistakes applying that rule incorrectly. This causes what we call an overgeneralization error. So they might, for example, have memorized the sentence stem like I didn't eat breakfast, or I didn't eat lunch. But then suddenly, after learning that eat is ate in the past tense, then suddenly, they start saying, I didn't eat breakfast. Eventually, they fix this error. Researchers refer to this phenomena as U-shaped learning. And we need to realize that learners must often get worse before they can get better. And the stage being corrected by a teacher might help, but it might also just make things worse. They're already confused. Another example of a universal in the language learning process is what some researchers refer to as learner varieties. These are kind of classifications or varieties in interlanguage, like an early variety, a later variety, and a final variety, right? So learner varieties are stages of development, and just like the natural order for morpheme acquisition, these stages probably exist for logical reasons. The first stage is called the pre-basic variety. In this stage, the learner can, of course, use the memorized formulaic expressions, but when they actually have to create their own sentences to communicate, they generally use no verbs and instead just, use single words. A person, for example, in this stage, if you ask a person to describe a group of children, like if you show them a picture and it shows a group of children playing baseball, and they have to describe that picture, they're just going to say one word. They're just going to say baseball. In the second stage, called the basic variety, the learner starts forming basic sentences with verbs, but drops many of the grammatical morphemes. He might say, he play baseball. In the final stage, known as post-basic variety, the learner creates sentences with verbs and uses morphemes to change those verbs. Now he can say, he is playing baseball, or he played baseball. As for why learners tend to follow these stages, the answer might be just quite simple. It may have something to do, again, with the limited processing power of the human brain. For a new language learner, it might be hard enough to recall the word that they need, just to recall that one word and articulate it correctly. In the second stage, the learner may be trying to use the grammar, but might still feel kind of overwhelmed, especially now that they're using 3 words instead of 1. It's like, if you're trying to juggle and you're new at juggling 3 balls is hard. Somebody asks you to juggle 5, then you're going to start dropping balls. Hopefully the learner uses this strategically and drops things that have little meaning. So that's why you end up with something that's kind of similar to what we call telegraphic speech in children. Besides morphology, SLA researchers have found that learners also go through predictable stages in the acquisition of syntax, phonology, pragmatics, lexicon, all that jazz. Manfred Pieneman, for example, has discovered that learners go through predictable stages when acquiring syntax. He concluded that learners will learn one word order routine first and must take some time to master that word order routine before they can start adding to it, mixing it up, changing it, moving it around. This idea is called processability theory because Pieneman believed the root issue was, again, humans limited processing power. One example he gives of this from his research is the way people acquire question formation in English. At first, they might use single words as questions simply by using rising intonation. So instead of saying tail, they say tail. Eventually, they start forming questions the same way they form other sentences. So they might say, it has a tail. Later, they start to add do or why to the front to make questions like, do it has a tail? Why it has a tail? Eventually, they form questions properly, but that can take a long time. It takes a long time for most learners to reach that final stage. Phonological development is also predictable in SLA, but somewhat different from the development of grammar forms. As you know, phonological development is the development of pronunciation. In second language learning, learners start out trying to pronounce L2 words using their own L1 sounds. So a Spanish speaker might use the Spanish R sound when speaking English, for example. Or a Korean person might pronounce English words such as bread like burede, because in the Korean language they don't have those clusters and final consonants. They don't have a cluster like bra. So they have to break it into bra. All right. They don't have that final consonant sound like bread, right? So they've got to make it bread, adding an extra vowel, basically. Um, like in everything interlanguage, however, the learners will slowly acquire the target language sounds over time, substituting the target language sounds for their own L1 sounds. Interestingly, the sounds that are the most common among all human languages are acquired much faster than the sounds that are extremely rare among human languages. Some people think this might have something to do with what Chomsky called universal grammar. So, for example, the strong R sound that we use here in the United States, this is a very rare sound in the world. Even if you visit other English speaking countries, they're not making this really strong English R sound that we have in America, right? It's a very rare sound among languages all around the world. Few second language learners ever master this sound. It takes a lot of effort for them to get that one. Last but not least comes the development of lexicon or vocabulary. Now, one of the problems in SLA is how researchers have been obsessing so much about grammar learning and not enough about vocabulary learning. Vocabulary acquisition clearly drives language learning. If you can learn a whole lot of vocabulary, then you can kind of make do, and you can communicate a lot with vocabulary without grammar. Okay. Vocabulary acquisition also goes through predictable stages, but it's kind of different from other things. In the first stage, the learner is using item learning to learn lexical phrases, formulaic expressions, and unanalyzed chunks of language, just like, with grammar, right? So they can memorize whole phrase such as where is the bus that goes to the airport without learning the meaning of each individual word in the phrase. So just like the grammar learning, they don't need to learn the grammar, they just need to memorize the whole phrase. At first, they might rely very heavily on translating their first language and expecting each word or phrase to have a perfect equivalent in the new language. Gradually, however, they start to develop an understanding of the L2 word's meaning and usage that is independent. Now, this can, however, be especially challenging if a word in one language does not have a word for word equivalent in the other language. So, using another example from Korean, Koreans might find it confusing, for example, that they have this one word, sago, but in English, that could be two different words. Sago could be accident. It could also be incident. Now, in English, we don't really think of an accident and an incident as the same thing. They're somehow very different to us. But for a Korean person, the difference between accident and incident is going to be very hard to learn. That's going to take them a very long time because they're not getting any help from their first language. ESL teachers can learn a lot from the people who research vocabulary acquisition. For example, research tells us that we don't simply add new words to our lexicon. Instead, we encounter unfamiliar words and gradually become more familiar with them over time. Receptive knowledge, for example, comes first. In other words, we learn to understand the word in context long before we have the ability to use the word. So we might be hearing the word when people are using it. We might be seeing the word on a page and kind of have an idea about it or get a gist of it, or maybe have some idea about how to translate the word. That's because, but actually using the word, what we call productive knowledge, it's very different. Productive knowledge of a word requires the knowledge of how to actually use the word in a sentence and what words it goes with, what words it doesn't go with, when to use the word, when not to use the word. So that whole issue of pragmatics, right? And of course, discourse. This change does not happen suddenly, it happens gradually. Research shows that words can be learned intentionally or incidentally. Intentional learning is when we're really trying to learn a word, like maybe memorizing the word, studying the word, right? But incidental learning is when we kind of accidentally learn a word because we hear it or see it being used and just kind of understand it because of the context. So incidental learning requires context. Could just be maybe there's a picture. So we see a picture of a glass of water and we see the word glass of water and we're like, oh, glass of water, right? Context. Now, if it's just a verbal context, however, then it requires the comprehension of the other words on the page. Most research suggests readers must understand 95% of the words on the page in order to acquire the other 5% incidentally. So, incidental learning requires that you have to be listening to or reading just the right level of input. It also requires multiple exposures. One exposure is probably not going to do it. So, in other words, vocabulary learning requires large amounts of reading and listening, and the text we are reading or listening to needs to be just the right level. All right. As you can see, researchers have learned a lot about interlanguage development in the past 50 years, but we still have a lot more to learn. As far as how to apply this when teaching, that's complicated. I'm going to leave that up to you. I hope this has been useful for you. Thanks.